in the Catholic Church, but of course it's a much more complex picture than that. We've been dealing across the world with a culture of individualism and materialism for a long time now, which particularly took off since the 1960s. But certainly from the 1990s on and into the new millennium, there has been, a real change in Irish society. And sadly, we have got to the point where there is a considerable degree of hostility to voices of faith and the voices of faith that might articulate what we might call traditional values. But having said that, there is still a sizable minority of people who either think with the church, so to speak, or whose values are essentially Christian in inspiration, but which, as I say, they have a rational basis for, and who cherish those values. While sadly there isn't a great degree of tolerance in mainstream media, there isn't a willingness to let those voices be heard to the extent which their share of public opinion might deserve. They are still there in considerable numbers. So if you take the referendum on abortion that took place in 2018, sadly people removed the constitutional protection of the unborn, gave permission for abortion legislation to take place, but 30, 32, 33% of people were opposed to that. Similar percentages to those that showed on the referendum on marriage in 2015. So there is a sizable thinking minority who are not with the new politically correct trend, and therefore, when I was running back in 2007, I felt that there was support for what we might call a thinking traditionalist type of voice. And when I say thinking traditionalist, what I mean, it's not a rejection of values that we don't like, that we see around us in society, but the proposal of positive alternative values which can be shared by all people, people of all faiths and none, who seek the common good, who seek human flourishing for each individual, but in the context of the importance of our community life.
And so you represent those values actively when you're running for office. So your constituency supports that, or so you and the other two candidates are in an opposing camp, I guess.
Yes, broadly speaking, I try to. It's clear I'm a distinctive voice in Irish politics. There's no doubt about that, and I'm a hate figure for some people if you pay too much attention to social media. Something I don't do. I would say my support base is there's a strong element of people, yes, who want to see the values that I represent not just be articulated, but to thrive in Irish society. But there are other people, I think, who are voting for me because they recognize that the atmosphere has become too stifling, that there is an increasing intolerance of different points of view, particularly if they go against the dominant elitist establishment cultural trend. But there are definitely people who would give me what somebody might call the Voltaire vote, if you like. The people who would vote for me, but not necessarily because they agree with what I say, but they think it's important that I and others would have the right to express those views. Or people who just want to hear different points of view articulated so that we can make the right decisions in society. Having said that, while my political I'm an independent politician, so I have a great measure of freedom when it comes to choosing my agenda. But I think it's important that whereas people have a very clear idea of some of the issues that have been career defining for me, at the same time, it's important to me and it's important for my political project that people see that my range of interests are not narrow. Because if we're sincere about promoting human flourishing, well, it doesn't just that's not just a question of sexual and reproductive ethics. That's a question of our economy and how it works, how we look out for the poor, how we treat immigrants in our society, particularly those who have come from backgrounds of persecution or extreme economic disadvantage, how we concern ourselves with issues like human trafficking and the modern slavery connected with it. If you think about it, most issues touch on human dignity. Again, coming from a Christian perspective, our job is to build the kingdom on earth, or to help build the kingdom on earth. And that means to see where the good is to be done in all the issues of life, whether it's sport, arts, culture, the economy, and indeed then the policy and legislative decisions that flow and that operate through those things.
But have you ever considered to join a party? Because of course, as an independent, you have the freedom, but it's very difficult to change anything if you don't have the support of a party where you can build alliances or so.
Yes, I have considered it, and on one occasion I was invited to join a party and to run for that party in the European elections, but in the end I didn't. And there are two main reasons for that. One, the path I took to get into politics involved running as an independent and seeking a university mandate, as I've explained. And the strong tradition there is for people to elect independent voices, because they've already had the opportunity to elect their government into parliament, to the lower house in the general election. So to some degree, my political career has been shaped by the initial choice that I made to run as an independent. But further to that, then, I have chosen to pursue that path of independence, possibly because I recognize that while parties are extremely important, and it's really, really important what you and other people are doing, and indeed what some people are doing in Ireland to try and bring their positive values forward through party political life, I'm pretty defined at this stage as a maverick voice, and perhaps the role that I can play is by being out there presenting the argument without fear or favor, not worrying about losing the party whip. But it's absolutely the case that for real progress to take place, we need other people to build on that and work through the party system. And I see that happening in two ways. You have examples of small parties like Aon Two, a small party led by a former Sinn Féin TD called Peadar Tóibín, a man who's been very courageous in his defence of the dignity of human life, but coming from a background of, if you like, strong Republican nationalism, given that he was a member of Parliament for Sinn Féin. He has a small political movement now which he's developing. Generally speaking, that's very difficult in Ireland because we don't have a list system. And what that means is, you know, to my eyes anyway, not being an expert on it, but looking in from outside at your system, you know, where you have a list system, you can have people who can run, if you like, on a national or over a considerable regional area. And if you get a certain percentage of the votes, you can claim that percentage within certain rules in parliamentary life. Our system is based on getting elected in local geographical constituencies. So there's a much greater emphasis on people's ability to deliver locally. And also the way the numbers, there are independent voices are frequently elected in those local geographical constituencies. But generally speaking, people tend to go with the traditional established parties. There has been a movement, certainly in recent years, a fragmentation in our system, and we have seen strong voices on the left. We have struggled to get centre-right party alternatives going. And I think part of the reason for that is that politics that veer towards the right have associations that many people of basic Christian outlook in our country would not be comfortable with. And you have a media that is very quick to label people who tend rightwards as extreme right. So because of the, if you like, the connotations of right-wing populism, for example, there's a certain, I think, fear of articulating those alternative values from a centre-right perspective. You have a media that tends to look more leftwards and in a more libertarian direction. That's not to make excuses. You know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in Ireland by people who want to articulate, if you like, a Christian-inspired political worldview. But to some degree, we face a challenge gaining traction for that because we have a certain labeling of our Christian legacy here in Ireland, where Catholic politics would be presented to people as something quite unattractive, as something confessional, as people not thinking for themselves, but having their line dictated by the church. So you have all this labeling that goes on, whereas many voters, while they might describe themselves as being essentially Christian in their outlook, they have been persuaded that that should have nothing to do with the political choices that they make. That's a very unhealthy development. It's something we need to work on changing in Ireland. It's something I try to do in my politics, is to say that there is an appropriate way for letting your light of faith, which is your ultimate take on reality, to have integrity, that must in some way shine on what you propose for the common good. But we have a lot of work to do on that in Ireland, and to some degree it doesn't help that we have a culture that's quite anti-intellectual. I often say in Ireland we've produced many great writers, but we don't produce so many great thinkers.
So I mean, in Austria, it's actually a similar position now. Not speaking about intellectuals now, although one could consider that too. With our Christian Democratic Party, and I think Fine Féin, I think it's called, would be your Christian Democratic Party, the traditional.
Well, Fine Gael would be the one that was in government, and which is still in government, would be the one that's aligned to the European People's Party, the Christian Democrats.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mix that up.
Yeah, but both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael would present themselves as centrist. But of course, what that means in Ireland is a large dose of political correctness in recent years, because the tendency of Irish politicians is to all rush to the centre, to look to see where public opinion is going, to be very mindful of how the media might portray them. And to that extent, I think an activist media in Ireland has had a major influence on shaping not just what our politicians say, but the way they say it and when they choose to stay silent and to go missing on issues, despite whatever personal political convictions they might have.
And what would your strategy be to change this culture? So now speaking for Ireland, but maybe for the whole of Europe, because basically in all of Western Europe, we have the same tendency. It's in Austria very similar. And of course, many people tell me, what are you doing in the People's Party? It's our Christian conservative, so traditionally conservative Christian party, and they say we should form an own party, etc., etc. And I have a different view on this. But what I guess you have put a lot of thought into this as well.
Well, I have, but it hasn't necessarily led me to much certainty about the conclusions. I mentioned, for example, a politician that I admire who's involved in running a small party and trying to build it up. And that's a party that's very nationalist, but would also give space to people who want to defend the dignity of human life at all stages. But by the same token, I frequently find myself encouraging young people coming through college and so on who are joining the mainstream political parties and encouraging them to be voices of dissent of a positive and constructive kind within their political movements. So it's always going to be a question, do you get on a bus that somebody else has provided and try and get into the driving seat and encourage people to tell the driver to go in a particular direction, or do you build your own bus? And there's no easy answer to that question. It's certainly, if you can build your own bus and it enjoys some kind of success, what you'll find is some of the other buses will start to want to go in the same direction. But by the same token, people, given that there is a natural bias in people in favor of voting for existing political parties, I encourage people to have a pragmatic point of view, to see what they can go with that is on the main political agenda of the parties, but to bring their core values and to try and to avoid becoming marginalized. But of course, what politicians must never do, or aspiring politicians must never do, is sell out on their core values in order to advance politically. Making the promise that, I will someday stand up for the right things, but only let me get ahead now and jettison my values in order to do so. Those people don't tend to turn up at the top and say, now that I'm there, I want to do the right things again. It just doesn't work like that. Yeah. So I think what we have to do is, first of all, to decide, if you like, in the same way that the church has as a preferential option for the poor, as people, perhaps to a greater or lesser extent, inspired by Christian faith and wanting to promote the common good, we should live a preferential option for media participation and a preferential option for political participation. And I think we've got to put the stress on developing positive human relationships among our peer groups, and working with people regardless of whether they agree with us or disagree with us, always seeing the positive intention and at some point then hopefully discerning whether to stay on one of the pre-existing buses that have been provided for the political journey, or to build a bus of their own. But there is no easy answer to that question of whether you set up something new or whether you work through existing parties. I think we need both, to be frank. And to some degree, I've lived that myself. When I was on the Irish parliamentary delegation to the Council of Europe, I encountered very good people in ECPM, the European Christian Political Movement, and I set up a political party here in Ireland called the Human Dignity Alliance, which is one of the member parties of the ECPM. But at the same time, while I was taking part in the events of the Council of Europe at the Parliamentary Assembly in Strasbourg, I sat as part of the wider EPP group. And I saw the diversity there. You had politicians with views on issues vastly different from mine, but also it was wonderful for me as a politician, often steering a lone course within the Irish Senate, to encounter and to work with politicians of very like mind from other countries who were part of the wider EPP group in Strasbourg. So I certainly got benefit out of working both with a small party, but also being able to work within a larger political group.
But I guess if one works within the party, as I do, and as I like to do, and I feel comfortable in my party, but one has to walk a fine line, because you were talking about the conscience. So
Yes.
where's the line I will not cross? So a few days ago, I was talking to Dan Lipinski, who you of course know, United States Congress, and who basically, he's still sitting in Congress, but he lost the last elections. Because he was not ready to withdraw from his pro-life stance. And so where's the line to draw? And I wonder, because if I remember correctly, in Ireland, you have also party line. And I think some good Catholic, but not even Catholic, just pro-life politicians had the choice to go with the party or even to be kicked out, was it? I think if you were not supporting. So how was this basically turning out? And so, I mean, do you understand those who gave in, and what happened to those who did not give in?
It's a bit like the story of the church in China, perhaps, with the underground Catholics and the members of the Patriotic Association. Perhaps that's a controversial comparison to be drawing, and maybe I should have thought that one through more before mentioning it. But you do recall correctly that, yes, in Ireland, prior to certain abortion legislation, which was preliminary to the abortion referendum, there was abortion legislation, legislating for limited abortion at the time, but on quite unjust grounds. And it is the case that several members of the then governing party, including our then Minister for European Affairs, Lucinda Creighton, a very talented politician as she was, voted with her conscience against the abortion legislation, and she not only lost the party whip, but of course she lost her job in the government. And I think it was quite clear from what happened to them that her party and her party leadership was acting in a very intolerant way. And I think it was clear to a lot of people that there really needs to be more room for voices of conscience, particularly on sensitive social issues. More recently, we saw it as well with the abortion referendum of 2018, where there was politicians in the various parties in the main parties were given freedom as to what position to take on the referendum, and quite a few members of the Fianna Fáil party, in fact perhaps even a majority, were opposed to the constitutional change. What I thought was regrettable then was when the constitutional change was made, they felt under pressure, and the majority of them gave in to the pressure to vote for the subsequent abortion legislation. And the reason they would have given was because the people had expressed a clear intention. But in fact, what the people had done in the constitutional change was to remove the issue from constitutional control and to give the freedom to the legislators to decide what type of abortion law we should have. And therefore, I think that was also a moment when politicians should have said, okay, I know what the majority of people are in favor of, but in fact, I have been given the freedom as a legislator now to legislate on this issue, and I believe we should go for something more restrictive than what is proposed. Sadly, very few of the group of those politicians who had initially supported the protection of the unborn at the referendum stage, very few of them pursued that conviction through the legislative stage. But while I might be disappointed by their failing there, it's very clear to me that once that's over, you've just got to start all over again with people. Tomorrow is a new day, always, and always has to be. So even when there's deep disappointment about what people have failed to do, we've got to look to the future and say, well, what are the issues that we can find now that we can cooperate on? So, well, we're at the very early stages of this in Ireland in respect of the protection of human life, but there are issues like, there needs to be a strengthening of the protection of medical personnel, for example, in terms of their conscience rights in the context of publicly available and publicly funded abortion services. We need legislation to require a measure of pain control where, in the relatively small number of cases where late-term abortions might be permitted. Up to now, the government proposing the abortion legislation wasn't interested in tolerating any discussion about any such exceptions. But I think those are the areas where I think we can work to educate people and hopefully over time try to build alliances politically, even with people who may disagree with us on the basic issue, but who might accept that there needs to be some more limitations than there exist at present. So it's important to have a positive disposition in politics so that you don't burn the bridges when you have a disagreement, even on something very, very important and fundamental.
Yeah. So what's our strategy here, and mine especially, but also of the platform Christdemokratie? It's the Christian Democratic Platform, which I was president of for the past few years, is to build up a strong Christian voice in the existing parties, but of course, especially in our Christian Democratic Party, the People's Party, and with our political system. You can vote people directly into the parliament or the city parliament.
Yes.
So in my case, if I get more or less 850 votes, if 850 people remember Ledóchowski, it's not that easy, unfortunately, I get elected. And then it is much easier, I guess, to vote for conscience, and to stay faithful, because I got elected by those people.
Yes.
Those 850, and they know exactly what I stand for.
Yes.
But what I still wonder, because when you mentioned that the majority was against it, why do you think they gave in? Was it because their principles were not really founded? That there was not really a foundation, or was it, I don't know, ambition or fear? What's the reason to give in? Because a politician, you're not there by coincidence.
Yeah. Well, I think Oscar Wilde said, that the truth is rarely pure and never simple. People talk about the pure truth or the simple truth. Well, one has to accept, first of all, that many politicians have not been formed on these kind of issues. I had the good fortune to go through university debates on this. I was probably predisposed to being an argumentative type of person anyway, but definitely I encountered people who helped me understand the issues at a deep level. And when you have that kind of foundation or formation, it helps you then, if I may borrow the phrase from the scripture, present a reason for the hope that you have, to borrow the letter of St. Peter, but to put it in a different context. So, if I have a strong sense of why what I believe is important, I'm going to feel more comfortable about advocating that within my party. But if, on the other hand, I'm operating from something more instinctive, and if I'm also then conscious of the fact that my political progress may depend on what I now do, it may be that I will not feel strong enough to stand up to the party political leadership. So in answer to your question, I believe that those who did vote for abortion subsequently, having opposed the constitutional change, I think it was partly a lack of strong formation for their instincts. They had the good instincts, but didn't have the formation in advocacy around the issue. Secondly, a consciousness of the fact that the media would seek to label them as being somehow anti-democratic. The people have spoken, but they're still trying to frustrate the people's indicated wishes. And definitely the question of advancement within their political parties, perhaps appointment to jobs should the party get into government, chairpersonships of committees, or indeed ministries or junior ministries. So, the pragmatic instincts of the politician perhaps smothering the remaining discomfort, a sense of helplessness that, look, this issue has been decided, so why are you still being awkward about this? All of those kind of pressures come into play. And I suppose then also a certain fatalism when it's clear that the issue is going to go through anyway and they're not in a position to present it. While I would say it's still important to give witness at that point, I can understand why a lot of people threw in the towel, gave up the battle, even on something as important as that issue.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you, because especially Ireland, as you mentioned, has had a very radical secularization. Mm-hmm. Just recently, I read in the Austrian newspapers that you just had one ordination of priests.
Yes.
One. And I think 30 years ago, there were 300 or so a year.
Yes.
Or was it 40 years? So that's, it's dramatically. So the culture really has changed. So now, just rational thinking, do we have any chance?
Do we have any chance of what?
Well, of reintroducing the culture of life.
Well, we do, but I think we have to accept that this is a long road, But I'm always at pains to say that the values that we are proposing should make sense to people of all faiths and none. Okay, and that must always be the, if you like, the tone in which we make our political contribution. But of course, it is also the case that the energy for the pro-life movement, and indeed the movement generally around, a range of issues, I suppose, respect for the spiritual search, the importance of parents' rights in educating their children according to their values, and having a schooling system that permits that, and that where the state respects that it's not in control, it's facilitating parental and family roles. Respect for marriage based on the union of a man and a woman. All of these issues, it's going to be a slow road back, but what they all have in common is they have a strong, rational, humanistic base. At the same time, the energy for that movement generally tends to come from people of faith. Why is that? Well, we can say that perhaps when people are not operating with a sense of the higher good that governs all things, then it's easy. It becomes easier to take the easy way out, to go for more individualistic decision making, for not taking what may be the harder road. If one thinks about euthanasia, for example, these things can be some things that are actually not conducive to human flourishing, can be presented in the short term as somehow being compassionate, without bigger global thinking and maybe a sense of eternal good. It seems to be harder for people to persist in the proposing of positive values. But so if we do for a moment then look at these issues through a Christian lens and look at the progressing of these issues through a Christian lens, we have to say, well, as Christians, what do we expect? It was never going to be easy in this world. It never has been easy in this world. So the idea that we can predict victories in the short term is naive. That's not our role. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, Saint Teresa as she now is associated with the phrase, you're not necessarily called on to be successful, you're called on to be faithful. First, to be faithful. And of course, you and I both want to enjoy political success, and thank God that isn't denied us. But the first thing is to be faithful, and that means being patient and just to work for what can be achievable in the here and now. And I think that points all the more importantly to the need to build relationships, to build alliances, even with people who disagree with us fundamentally on very important things. So, for example, you will encounter people who have a strong insight into why euthanasia or assisted dying is not good for the culture, because they see how old people might start to feel like a burden, or how selfish economic interests might say it is better that people die rather than we provide expensive healthcare for them. You know, those kind of utilitarian arguments. Some of the people who will walk that road with you may not be able to share with you, sadly, the view that unborn children should be protected in the law. So you have a decision. We all have a decision. Do I make common cause with this person? And the answer is, of course. So when you say that you hope to, get people not just marking the party list, but also marking Ledóchowski I understand that they'll vote for the party and they'll vote for you. That means it's very, very sensible for you to reach out to as many people as you can of like mind and make sure they vote for the person who will represent their values. But I've no doubt that as an intelligent man and I know you're an intelligent man because I've met you many times and it's great to always be in touch with you, you will also ask people for votes even when they don't agree with your values, but because they like your dress sense, or they like your art of conversation, or just because they believe you're a man of integrity, or because you have found some issues and where you do actually agree with them. Now, I completely accept that for you and for me, 80% of the energy may have to go into cultivating the core vote, the values constituency. But to be effective, not just in getting elected, but to be seen as effective advocates, to be persuasive of people who are not so sure, you and I also need to be convincing on issues where on other issues to people who might not find common cause with us, even on things that are very fundamental to human welfare and flourishing.
That's very good advice, Ronan. Thank you.
I know you don't need me to give it, that you have it internalized a long time ago, but
not necessarily, and because as you well know, there's always the temptation, to just take the easy part, maybe even take the more populist route, and pretend that you are the pure one, the just one, and the system has nothing to do with you, and it's just not true.
Yeah,
we are in this fallen world, and we have to work together.
Yes.
And I always, and I have quite now a number of good friends who are in politics, and I see how they struggle, and I see how they have to make decisions, and sometimes I don't understand the decisions.
Yes.
But I just trust them that they did as good as they could, and I don't know everything. What's going on.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
We don't know the compromises which have been agreed on other issues, maybe. And that's so right. It's really difficult.
I don't know if you like country and western music, but the singer Kenny Rogers had a song called "The Gambler." I won't sing it for you now, but there's the chorus. It was an old gambler who dies giving advice to another gambler on the train. I hope your support base aren't, strongly anti-gambling, or I'll now be causing a scandal for you. But the chorus says you've got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. There's a time to speak, but there's also a time to hold back on your opinions. And that's not that can be as much an art as a science. Obviously, one never ever deceives. It's important to have integrity, but the idea that you run at every lamppost, or that you charge at every windmill, of course, is fatal to effective politics. There's a great scene in the movie A Man for All Seasons about St. Thomas More, which I often recall in conversation with friends, where the oath has been published, and the man who will be St. Thomas More meets his daughter and asks to see the wording of the oath, because he says, perhaps I'll be able to take this oath. He doesn't want to be a martyr. He will be a martyr if he has to be, but if he can find a formula where he can take that oath in good conscience, and perhaps mentally reserve certain other things he doesn't want to say about the king or about that oath, then he was ready to do it. And I think that showed the right kind of, will we call it, practical wisdom that a politician needs to have. But as you say, that doesn't mean that there's always an easy answer. There will be moments when people will take a different stance around these prudential decisions than you might take or I might take. And as you rightly say, it can be difficult to understand. And in the end, all we can do is just say, okay, it's done now. Where do we go now together?
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's also why it's so important. I guess you have it true, to build kind of a community, also a
Yes.
spiritual community around myself and other believing politicians, or just people of goodwill, that we are not
Exactly.
alone. Yeah,
that is extremely important. And I have been blessed in my own political life to have people who, you know, value what I try to do. They might wish they had somebody who was better at it, but they know that my intentions are good, or basically good, and they want to say, you know, I want to help. But again, there's always, and maybe it's the story of our church, there's always the, and on the other hand side of that. You know, I often ask myself, you know, have I too many friends who think the same way as I do on things? Because, you know, it's easier hanging around with people. And let's be honest, part of what makes friendship real for us is where we have things in common, whether it's the memory of a holiday we took together, or whether it's, you know, the fact that we like the way we reinforce each other's values. Yeah. You know, friendship can and is inevitably going to be about things we have in common with people. Yes. But to be really effective in the world is perhaps to always have one's heart open to the possibility of forming friendships that can really be surprising friendships, because they are friendships with people with whom we have relatively little in common, or with whom we differ on really important things. I'm not good at that. I want to be better at it. And I think, and you know, if I'm better at it in my personal life, perhaps it will also augur well for my ability to be more persuasive in my political life.
Well, I guess, I mean, the least, or maybe not the least, maybe the best one can do is to be self-aware of those limitations. So just yesterday, and I think that's so beautiful about the church, because it's you know, it's in every social hierarchy. I was speaking to a pastor, and he has a ministry in a working class you know, area, and I must admit, this is not my world. Yeah, I'm from a different social background, and they have a
you like a bit of posh.
Sorry,
you're a bit more posh.
I'm a bit more posh and snobbish. That's maybe how I'm perceived. I don't know. I understand. But I am who I am. You know, I cannot offer more than who I am and the experiences I have. But what I can do is talk to people like this pastor, and ask him for his advice, how he sees things, how he perceives social injustice. Where I'm, you know, very, very prone to say, well, that's life. Yeah. But he says, no, it's easy for you to say that in your position. For us, it's not that. So, so that's all I can offer, you know, to get into a conversation, to learn from people. And I cannot offer more, unfortunately. I'm not Mother Teresa of Calcutta.
And of course, it's no harm to remember, you know, they say love is a decision, and that's not just in, you know, marital situations, but it's you know, sometimes it's not how we feel, it's what we decide to do that is the test of our attempted virtue, if you know what I'm saying. In that you don't necessarily have to like walking the meaner streets, but if you choose to do so in order to do some good, well, then that's a really great thing. You know, I don't think it's expected of us that we change our fundamental preferences, you know, or that our natural inclinations. How you feel is sometimes beyond your control. It's what you do in the light of how you feel. Isn't that how hopefully we'll be judged?
Exactly. And I've made a decision, so I hope I keep with it. Ronan, because we are coming to an end, I have two questions. The first one, if you could say some Irish poetry, please.
Okay, do you mean poetry, Irish poetry in England, or in English, or Irish poetry in Irish?
In Irish, of course.
Okay, well, I will give you one verse in Irish. Go rega van na drivo, asta volocht no bichan, the honig mishagon go ban is bavogo a van. And that was basically a poem that translates in English as, "O woman of three cows, don't let your tongue thus prattle. Many's a time I met a woman with only 2 cattle, or something like that. The idea, going back to the old days, the woman who had 3 cows thought she was better than the woman who had 2 cows. And the poem is one that's admonishing her not to be boasting and looking down on her neighbor who has a little bit less than her, you know. That's an old Irish poem that I suppose reflects the agrarian society.
Yes.
But we have, of course, more famous poetry. Perhaps most Irish people would be more familiar with Irish poetry in English. Most
Obviously,
famously, people like William Butler Yeats. But we have
yes.
a lovely poet, Patrick Kavanagh, who would be very much a poet of rural things. And of course, more recently, Seamus Heaney, who was a Nobel Prize winner, wrote some beautiful poetry. I recommend, if people want to Google a poem about, they've won a prize in Ireland a number of years ago, about peeling potatoes with his mother, you know, when all the others were away at mass. It's a sonnet about a time spent with his mother peeling potatoes as a child. And then when he's at her graveside and the priest is reciting the prayers, he recalls the time they spent together when he was in that moment with her, as he puts it, never closer all the rest of our lives. So we have a great old tradition, all right, but other countries do too. But I'd recommend the poetry of Seamus Heaney, William Butler Yeats, Patrick Kavanagh. Now leave the check reins slack, the seed is flying far today. The seed like stars against the black eternity of April clay. This seed is potent as the seed of knowledge in the Hebrew book. So plant I think I've forgotten the rest of it, but as you can see, it's a poem encouraging the farmer as he plants his seed to reflect on the seed of knowledge in the Bible.
Beautiful, beautiful. And then the last question. Suppose somebody calls from Vienna and asks you for your recommendation for whom to vote. What would you recommend?
Oh, I'd say go for that Christian Democratic list, but don't just vote for the list. Go for Ledóchowski when you're marking your individual preference. I give them an English slogan: lead with Ledóchowski.
Wow. Okay. Good. We have thought so long about a good slogan.
Well, I don't know how that translates into German, though. We'll have to. But
lead with Ledóchowski. I must think about it. But the LL is good. Ronan. Thank you so much. I hope to see you soon in person again. And thank you took your time. All the best, all the success. I think you have been re-elected recently, I think. So
thanks be to God. Yes.
You have a good some years ahead of you for good political work. And I hope next year we meet again, both as politicians and yeah.
God bless you and yours and your politics and your campaign. And I look forward to getting good news in October.
You will. Thank you. Und meinen Zuschauern sage ich auch vielen Dank. Besucht mich auf www.ledóchowski.at oder auf meiner Facebook-Seite und wir hören und sehen uns beim nächsten Live.